April 1943. The sky above northern France looked like polished glass, thin, cold, waiting to break. Through the canopy of his Messerschmitt, Oberleutnant Franz Keller watched a heavy silver machine crawling upward below. Too fat, he thought, too slow. He dipped his wings and rolled to meet it. Somewhere inside his mask, a confident smile. When he fired his first burst, the laughter of 100 briefings echoed in his ears. Seconds later, when the stranger did not fall but kept climbing into his sights with a steady, patient hunger, that laughter cracked. They called it the Jug, a name without grace, without music. It looked like someone had taken a beer barrel, glued on wings, and dared it to fly. But beauty is a concept for peace. War prefers endurance. Republic Aviation's P-47. Thunderbolt was not built to impress. It was built to survive. The German pilots would learn this slowly and at great cost. Years earlier, on a drafting table covered with blue pencil marks and cigarette ash, Alexander Kartveli had imagined such survival. A refugee from one continent, he understood the logic of catastrophe. The Army Air Forces wanted a single-engine fighter that could escort bombers high, fast, and far. Kartveli's answer was paradox. Instead of building lightness, he built margin. A 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney double wasp radial engine. A turbo supercharger tucked deep into the fuselage. Thick wings to hold fuel and firepower. Armor around the pilot as though the airplane expected punishment. When a colleague remarked that the design looked more like a tank than a fighter, Kartveli only nodded. Tanks, after all, survive. The first test flights confirmed the joke. Heavy on the stick, slow to climb. Pilots nicknamed it the 7-ton milk bottle. But at altitude, the numbers whispered a different truth. The supercharger made the engine breathe as if the sky were thicker. Top speed approached 430 miles per hour. The dive limit pushed beyond what any enemy dared. And when engineers calculated how much punishment the airframe could take, they began to understand that the airplane might outlive its pilots. "I've seen this pattern before," said the voice that was not a man, but memory itself. The observer, our unseen narrator, the one who stands outside time, watched the Jug roll down its first runway. Humanity always confuses grace with strength. They build for elegance until the world reminds them that elegance burns. The voice faded into wind and prop wash. When war finally introduced the Thunderbolt to its opposite numbers, the meeting was ungentle. Spring of 1943 saw the first P-47s over Europe, flying out of England. The men of the 56th Fighter Group climbed heavy and landed heavier, learning through each sortie how to coax performance from mass. At first, the Germans dismissed them. American fighters had been good targets so far, clumsy, overfueled, predictable, but the Jug was none of these for long. Each wing held 4 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, 8 barrels spitting fire. A single 2-second burst threw nearly 150 rounds of heavy metal into the air. A curtain that could shred an engine or tear open a train car. Pilots spoke of the recoil as if the airplane growled. In the gun camera films, you can see the tracers walk toward targets in neat, brutal lines. One pilot said later, "It didn't shoot them down, it erased them." At first, they used the Jug for high-altitude escort. The big radial engine thrived where air was thin. Bomber crews, weary from months of dying unprotected, began to notice new silhouettes sliding beside their formations. The B-17s carried faith. The Jugs carried defiance. German interceptors still came, but now they paid for every pass. A few even reported home that the American barrel could dive so fast it vanished. The Luftwaffe command doubted the claim until test pilots confirmed it. The P-47 could exceed 500 miles per hour in a dive and remain intact. No Messerschmitt dared follow. The pilots adapted their doctrine to the airplane's personality. You didn't dogfight in a Jug. You hit hard, dived out, and came back for more. Energy fighting, they called it. altitude into speed, speed into fire, fire into distance. It required patience and discipline. The men who mastered it became legends. Zemka, Gabreski, Johnson, names that echoed like code words across airfields. In the calm between missions, the narrator returned. They begin to learn the mathematics of survival, he said softly. One cannot always outdance death. Sometimes one must outweigh him. His silhouette flickered across hangar shadows and vanished. By midsummer, the Thunderbolt's legend was spreading, but it remained chained by fuel. The early models lacked external tanks. Their range ended halfway to the Rhine. Pilots watched bombers vanish eastward and waited for their return, sometimes waited in vain. Kartvelli's team answered quickly. A belly shackled with metal drums of gasoline, releasable once empty. Now the jugs could fly deeper, and Germany began to feel the pressure in its own skies. February 1944. Big week. Allied command threw everything they had at the Reich's aircraft industry. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Leipzig. The plan was savage simplicity. Cripple the factories, force the Luftwaffe into open combat, and bleed it dry. The jugs led the way at dawn, heavy with drop tanks, climbing through frozen contrails toward a horizon that pulsed with flak. Over Regensburg, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson's flight ran into a swarm of Focke-Wulfs. He was hit, oil splattering his windshield, engine coughing blood. He rolled, dove, fired. The radial refused to quit. Holes in the wings, tail half chewed, canopy jammed, he flew home blind until the channel shimmered below. Ground crews counted 238 holes. Johnson climbed down, pale and steady. She got me back, he said. That's all that matters. The jug earned its myth not in victory, but in endurance. Its engine, wrapped in armor and stubbornness, kept pilots alive where others would have flamed out. A German ace later wrote, "You could hit it, and it would not notice." In the statistics of war, such small defiance becomes strategy. If one pilot lives to fight tomorrow, tomorrow changes. Spring rolled west into France. The Allies prepared for an invasion whose name none yet spoke aloud. The Thunderbolt, once guardian of bombers, became something rougher. Hardpoints appeared under wings, rockets, bomb racks. The thick airfoils that once offended elegance became shelves for destruction. The P-47 became the world's most expensive plow, and the fields it plowed were full of steel. In a village near Caen, a farmer's son would later describe it this way: "We heard thunder before the rain." He meant the roar of radials, the trails of dust, where convoys once stood. For the infantry below, that sound meant salvation. For those beneath the crosshairs, it meant disappearance. As June approached, weather turned treacherous. Training accidents mounted. Engines failed under strain. Yet the jug units kept flying. They were building something intangible, trust between air and ground. A soldier could look up, see that broad-shouldered silhouette, and know that someone had remembered him. Then came June 6th, Normandy. The morning the sea itself seemed to move. Thunderbolts prowled the roads beyond the beaches, destroying anything with wheels. One flight spotted a German armored column emerging from a forest near Villers-Bocage. They rolled in, released bombs, and the forest bloomed fire. A gunner on Omaha Beach looked up from his sand-filled bunker just in time to see a jug dive past, rockets screaming. He never saw the pilot's face, only the word "lucky" painted on the cowl. The narrator returned once more, his tone almost reverent. They call themselves men of science, but this is faith. Faith in metal, in comrades unseen. Faith that when you descend into hell, something will follow you down and light the way out. Then he was gone again, a flicker between clouds. By the end of that summer, the roads of France were graveyards of machines. Columns bombed, trains cut, bridges snapped like bones. The German army, retreating east, began to fear the sky even on clear days. A single jug overhead could halt an entire division's movement. It was no longer air superiority, it was air tyranny. The next phase of the war would test that tyranny against desperation. As the Allies crossed the Seine, the Luftwaffe counterattacked with everything left. Jet prototypes, elite squadrons, night fighters pressed into daylight. The Jug met them head-on. Less glamorous than the new P-51s, but unyielding. A slow warplane only in peace. In combat, it moved with inevitability. Autumn 1944 turned the map of Western Europe into a set of overlapping wagers. Bridges taken too quickly, towns bypassed too easily, supply lines stretched like violin strings. Air power tried to compensate for optimism. The Thunderbolt's days shifted from tidy escort schedules to frantic calls. A column sighted near a canal, a train racing for the Ardennes, a bridge rumored to be mined. The cab rank pattern matured. Flights orbited in stacked altitudes, listening, waiting. On the ground, a forward air controller keyed a radio and spoke the simplest possible language. Crossroads, 1 kilometer south of the church tower. Gun flashes from a hedgerow. Armor on the road to St. Vith. A minute later, someone above answered in the affirmative, rolled inverted, and wrote a reply with rockets. Operation Market Garden asked for miracles. Airborne divisions fell on Dutch bridges with the courage of myth, and for a few days, it seemed as if audacity alone could end a war. Thunderbolts flew top cover and close support across the flat country, where every line of smoke betrayed a story. On the road to Arnhem, trains rattled forward, and the Jugs hunted them in pairs. One to pin the locomotive with gunfire, the other to lance it with a single HVAR into the boiler. Pilots came home that week with eyes too wide and words too few. One of them, 21 and already older than his photograph, wrote, "The sky was a chessboard, and we were pawns that learned how to hit like queens." The narrator reappeared on an airstrip bathed in low northern light. "Nothing reveals doctrine like failure," he murmured. "The lesson they steal today, they will spend with interest tomorrow. The Jug does not gloat. It simply returns to work." Far behind the lines, a different miracle kept the whole machine moving. Convoys pounded the roads day and night. The Red Ball Express, fleets of trucks feeding armies that outran their own shadow. When a bridge failed or a crossroads jammed, Thunderbolts were summoned not as avengers, but as civil engineers with explosives. A pilot later joked that he had never thought of himself as a road crew, until the day he flattened a farmhouse just to widen a turn for 100 trucks. It was a brutal arithmetic, and when it worked, a division advanced 6 miles instead of 2. Every mile gained with fuel, and food was a mile purchased with reconnaissance and gun runs. The airplane and the truck discovered they were brothers. The Luftwaffe fought back wherever fuel and courage allowed. New FW-190 variants with improved roll and climb prowled at treetop height, hoping to catch fighter bombers slow and low. The Jug answered by adjusting its rhythm. A high cover element with full guns and minimal ordnance, and a low element with bombs to drop and speed to spend. More than once, a German pilot, hunting for a solitary Jug in its bombing dive, found instead a patient sentinel above him, who had been waiting for the hunter. By December, the forests grew quiet and deceptive. Snow fell in the Ardennes, muffling engines, flattening light, turning the world into a monochrome that hid danger in clean lines. The German counteroffensive erupted like a trap sprung by winter itself. Tanks shouldered through the woods, infantry wrapped in white moved along ditches, and the sky closed. For days, weather grounded fighters. Convoys burned for lack of a watchful sky. American regiments fought blind. When the ceiling finally lifted, pilots scrambled with the urgency of men who understood exactly how many hours had been stolen. Thunderbolts found the bulge the way miners find a seam, by feeling it underfoot. They struck roads clogged with armor and half-tracks, raked columns that had traveled at night and believed themselves unseen. One veteran described a pass near Bastogne, where the world bent around the front sight and became only smoke and sparks, and the brief flash of a tanker opening a hatch to look up at his fate. Another wrote of coming home in twilight, hearing his radio crackle with the one word that made sense of the day: hold. He knew it meant the town was still there, and the men inside were still alive. Even in that winter, the jug showed its peculiar gift for surviving what it should not. Air-cooled engines liked cold air. Performance sharpened. Radiatorless, the Thunderbolt did not fear a single burst, finding its water heart. Ground crews worked with numb fingers and tools that stuck to metal. Pilots walked across steel that creaked and protested. And yet the sorties flew again and again, like a heartbeat refusing to yield to fever. As 1945 opened, a fatigue fell across enemy units that had nothing to do with sleep. Rail yards could be repaired, bridges thrown across rivers with heroic speed, factories moved into caves, but the sky kept finding them. The Thunderbolt was not a genius sniper. It was a relentless prosecutor. If a target existed, it would be indicted by morning and sentenced by noon. An episode over the Ruhr became cautionary legend. A group of jugs was vectored to a power substation feeding a synthetic fuel plant. The target looked small from altitude, unglamorous, unheroic, but the briefing officer had circled it in red and underlined it twice. The first pair went in with bombs, the second with rockets, the third with guns to sow chaos into the repair crews. 80 minutes later, the grid coughed and fell. A week later, a German armored battalion reported operating at half strength for lack of fuel. Power and petrol, the two invisible rivers of total war, had been diverted at their source by airplanes that were supposed to be too slow. Along the way, the jug gathered pieces of other people's lives. A piece of flak that struck a foot pedal and lived there as a charm. A saint's medallion taped under a gun sight by a Catholic from Boston. A reconciliation letter the pilot would never mail, folded inside a map case. Wingmen began to catalog their own superstitions, and superstition is only another word for uncertain gratitude. When a man survives, he needs a reason. The jug provided enough reasons to keep men sane. The narrator's voice drifted over a maintenance tent, where a crew chief argued with a dented cowling. "Machines are built for the men who will ask too much of them," he said. The jug is honest about this. It does not pretend to be delicate. It promises only to come again. The crew chief swore, wiped his hands, and smacked the cowling into place with a rubber mallet. The airplane took a breath and forgave him. By March, the Rhine glinted like a boundary between worlds, past and future, ambition and defeat. Allied armies prepared crossings that would carve the last illusions from the map. Thunderbolts methodically reduced the arteries feeding the West Bank. Ferry slips, pontoon stores, rail bridges assembled by midnight only to vanish at noon. An engineer officer watching from binocular range commented that the Air Force had acquired the instincts of a sapper, and the sapper had acquired the sky's reach. In this marriage of specialties, there was less romance and more certainty. Individual combats still punctuated the campaign, sharp and personal as duels in a crowded street. An FW-190 streaked low along a river, hoping to hide in its reflection. A jug, higher and faster in a dive, arrived with the gravity of a falling roof. The German rolled left, then right, the American anticipating, not chasing. The Browning spoke in a single sustained sentence. Wood splinters and coolant streamed from the enemy's wing root. The 190 skipped once on the water, then entered it and did not emerge. The jug pulled up hard, a heavy bird climbing with audible effort, and flew on toward the next call. In towns newly liberated, children learned to draw airplanes from memory. Some drew twin booms and called them lightnings. Some drew needle-nosed racers and called them mustangs. And some drew a barrel with wings and grinned as if the joke were theirs to tell now. Pilots found those drawings and kept them like spare parts for their hearts. The deeper the Allies pushed, the stranger the targets became. fuel drums stacked under pine boughs, decoy aircraft made of wood that fooled no one, trains split into three parts and hidden in tunnels. The Jug's answer remained monotonous. Find, hit, leave, return. Monotony in war is mercy wearing a uniform. It lets men wake up and know what the day demands. They also hit memories. In one raid near Castle, Thunderbolts smashed a bridge the enemy had built with a pride older than the current war. An old man standing nearby wept as the arches fell, not for the cause, but for the craft. A pilot wrote later that he had not known which hurt more, the bridge's collapse or the old man's grief. Such moments stain victories and make honest soldiers older. By April, the enemy's sky was full of gaps. No radar coverage here, no fighter response there, no flak at all in places that used to glare with it. The Jug still took wounds, but now the wounds felt like the last arguments of a cause that had fallen behind its own promises. The war was ending the way machines do, not with a single catastrophic failure, but with 1,000 little ones that add up to silence. In the last weeks, a pilot from the 56th wrote home, "I think about the first time I saw her and laughed. That wasn't the Jug's fault. That was mine. I didn't yet understand that some things are too deliberate to be pretty." He enclosed a photograph, him leaning against the cowl, a crew chief in the background, a sky the color of worn steel. The letter arrived after victory, and the person who opened it understood suddenly why the man had come back so many times. It wasn't only courage. It was the faith that the machine would keep its side of the bargain. May arrived not like a trumpet, but like a sigh. Columns of prisoners shuffled along roads that used to belong to them. Airfields lay open to the wind, their revetments empty, their fuel soaked into the dirt and gone. Thunderbolts still flew, not because anyone doubted the outcome, but because finishing a task well is its own kind of respect, for the living, for the dead, for the machine that carried you between both. The last enemy Keller faced, the same pilot who had once laughed at the Silver Brute, came not in a duel, but in a glimpse. He was on the ground, finally, staring up at an airplane that roared across a captured field, low and unapologetic. He raised his hand against the sun and saw, briefly, the broad nose and the 8 black circles like quiet ultimatums. He did not curse it. He simply nodded, as if an argument had concluded, and he could at last accept the verdict. After the surrender, the Jug looked too large for peacetime. Peace demands efficiency and forgets about armor. Factories turned to newer shapes, jets that promised speed without compromise. Yet in other skies, the P-47 found more work. Latin America, the Balkans, the Far East, painting new roundels on old courage. Wherever airfields were rough and flak was not a rumor. The big radial and the thick wings still made sense. Pilots carried the Thunderbolt forward in memory, even when they strapped into different machines. Some swore they could feel, in turbulence, the old weight under their hands. Some, walking past an air museum years later, stopped without meaning to and looked too long at a familiar curve of cowling. They had survived their youth, which is harder than it sounds, and the Jug had been the unlikely adult in the cockpit. The narrator stood once more at the edge of a runway that no longer needed him. "History remembers the elegant first," he said, "and then the decisive." The Jug was not a marble statue. It was a cornerstone. Men built other triumphs upon it because it did not crack when weight increased. He looked at the silent airplane and seemed, for a heartbeat, to pity the world that would only read numbers and not the pact those numbers hid. In the documents, the Jug's contribution is split into categories: sorties flown, tons of bombs dropped, vehicles destroyed, aircraft claimed. Statistics are useful. They are also deaf. They cannot hear a crew chief's laugh when a patched engine starts on the second try. They cannot hear a soldier's breath steady because a shape he trusts appeared in a hostile sky. They cannot hear the way pilots learn to end their prayers with practical requests: good weather over the target, a runway that holds, a machine that forgives errors made in fear. One summer after the war, a pilot visited a farmer's field where he had once bellied in a wounded machine. The farmer's son was there again, taller, the boy who had talked about thunder before rain. He led the pilot to a corner of the barn where a panel from the jug's wing hung like a relic. On it, with a childish hand, he had painted a circle and 8 little lines in a row. The pilot touched the metal, half expecting it to be warm. He asked the boy what it meant. The boy shrugged. "It means you came back," he said. People often ask what the enemy thought of the Thunderbolt. The honest answer is that the enemy did not think in nouns. He thought in verbs. He hid. He ran. He repaired. He tried again. The jug turned these actions into questions with only one kind of answer. You can read surviving German reports and find the clinical phrases, fast in the dive, strong, survivable. But buried inside them is the admission that morale is mortal. When men believe the sky belongs to someone else, they fight the ground. And the ground, once stripped of its roads and bridges, fights back against them. The jug taught a set of lessons engineers still quote without naming the teacher. Add margin. Protect the human. Design for the worst day, not the best. Power is necessary. Forgiveness is decisive. Do these things, and you may build something that embarrasses beauty by outliving it. In a world eager for the new, the Thunderbolt's legacy is a quiet argument for the proven. There's a photograph from late in the war, a line of jugs at dusk, canopies reflecting a low sun, crew chiefs walking the length of each wing with gloved hands. In the distance, a truck rattles across pierced steel planking, and beyond that, a church spire that somehow never fell. The men in the picture are not posing. They are tired. The machines are not showing off. They are waiting. It looks like any other evening, which is precisely the victory. When extraordinary effort becomes ordinary, a war is ending. Keller, old and unimportant now, kept a small notebook from the war. In it, between pages of fuel figures and names of friends who did not return, he wrote a single line about the jug. It was not the fastest airplane, he admitted, but it was the fastest at ending arguments. He did not mean just dogfights. He meant the arguments men hold with fear, with doubt, with the part of themselves that believes a task is impossible until a machine arrives that disagrees. Years later, on an air show weekend, a restored Thunderbolt roared down a runway and lifted into a blue that seemed too small for it. The crowd winced at the sound and then smiled because the sound promised something old and reliable. The pilot leveled off, made a slow pass, rolled, and climbed. The children pointed, the veterans nodded. The wind carried the smell of high-octane fuel and a rumor of memory. For a moment, the world remembered what it had forgotten, that sometimes the tool that looks too slow is simply conserving its strength. The narrator spoke for the last time, and if a voice without lungs can sound gentle, his did. They called it too slow, he said, but they were measuring the wrong race. They timed minutes over distance and neglected to count the lives brought home. In the only contest that matters, the one between a man and the day he fears, the jug was swift. The field went quiet. The airplane in the sky made a wide curve like a signature and disappeared into sun. He who laughed at it the first time never laughed again. He learned, as the rest of his century did, that deliberation is not delay, that strength need not be graceful to be good. The Thunderbolt kept its promise to the men who trusted it. And because it did, they kept theirs to the world they gave back. In the weeks after the snow melted from the hedgerows, the air war adopted a steadier, almost workmanlike tempo. Pilots who had once measured their days by dogfights began to speak in the grammar of logistics, sorties, tonnage, interdiction windows, target servicing. It sounded unromantic and felt essential. War had matured into schedule and consequence. The Thunderbolt, once the newcomer proving it could breathe at altitude, had settled into the role of an unflinching tradesman. If the job required violence, it performed violence. If the job required patience, long orbits, fuel management, a second or third pass to finish a stubborn bridge abutment, it supplied patience. When ground commanders asked what the air could promise, the answer increasingly came in the confident plural: we can hold the road net, we can smother daylight movement, we can keep the river crossings honest. A bomber crewman remembered Big Week differently from the fighter pilots who covered him. To him, it was a theater of smells and sounds. The cold iron tang of oxygen, cordite in the throat after the waist gun fired, the unearthly quiet when the interphone cut out for a heartbeat, and everyone in the airplane listened to his own mortality. On the second day, his formation lumbered toward Leipzig through a sky stitched with black flowers. He saw, for the first time, the silver darts of escorts skimming above and behind, and he realized with a private shock that they were not there for ceremony. A dark cross flashed past his window, an interceptor overshooting, a line of tracers threading the space where his body had been 1 second earlier, and then a jug dropped into view on the German's tail and wrote a sentence he could not hear, but understood anyway. The bomber shuddered as a shell burst close. The top turret barked. The pilot swore without realizing his mic was open. Hours later, the crew counted flak holes and fingers and found, to their surprise, that the numbers still matched. He swore he had felt the fighter's presence not as a shape, but as a pressure, like a hand between his ship and the sky. The Jug's turbo supercharger, so awkward to accommodate in the fuselage's belly, proved itself again and again. It was a mechanical lung with its own brain, a set of veins and ducts that learned the pilot's desire and supplied the engine with the world it needed. At 30,000 feet, where breath thins and mistakes thicken, the double wasp still drank deeply. Pilots trusted that sensation, throttle response that did not lag, a climb that demanded resolve but rewarded technique, the comfort of hearing a radial's low thunder rather than the fragile hiss of liquid-cooled plumbing. They joked that the airplane had moods and that the supercharger was how it argued. In truth, it was how the airplane forgave. A German mechanic on an FW-190 line near Kassel kept a private notebook of grudges. He hated the cold. He hated the shortages. He hated the way good men began to speak of luck as if it were a doctrine. He also hated the big American radial fighter for a specific reason. It made his math meaningless. Damage that should ground a machine for a week brought the Jug back in a day. Hits that would have boiled a coolant system into steam simply became oil streaks wiped away with rags and resin. When he wrote, "They do not obey our arithmetic," he was not being poetic. He was asking why his world no longer answered to the rules it had taught him. On a sunbitten afternoon east of the Seine, 2 Thunderbolts and 3 Mustangs escorted a reconnaissance Lightning toward a rail junction near Nancy. The brief had been simple: confirm enemy rail repair and smash it if risk was acceptable. It turned complicated the way simple things do in war, quickly at once, in every direction. Flak appeared like punctuation over the junction, and 2 Focke-Wulfs dove out of a broken cloud deck, banking toward the Lightning's silver vulnerability. The Jugs were lower than the Mustangs, and for 1 second, the formation looked wrong. Fast racers above, heavy brawlers below, the intended prey in the middle. The Thunderbolt flight lead did not try to climb into a turning fight he could not win. He tucked his nose, went to idle for a heartbeat to steepen his angle, then firewalled the throttle and rolled into a dive at a slope that felt impolite. The airplane gathered weight and speed with relief, as though agreeing. At 600 feet, the Jug roared through the crossing geometry and put 8 short lines across the belly of the trailing FW-190. Pieces came off like confession. The Mustang element cleaned the second attacker with elegance. The Lightning finished its photograph like a professional ignoring a bar brawl. They went home through air that now smelled of hot oil and cordite and spent fortune. A captain in the 56th Fighter Group kept a list not of victories, but of returns. Sorties flown, pilots back, airframes patched, engines that lived one more day than expected. His column of numbers had the quiet satisfaction of a farmer's ledger. The Thunderbolt suited such men who respected repetition as a kind of heroism. Night after night, he walked the line, hand on cowling after cowling, as if counting cattle at dusk. He learned the temper of each ship by the way the metal held heat. by the sound a panel made when he rapped it with his knuckles. He believed in luck, but trusted maintenance more. When asked after the war whether he had loved the jug, he shrugged. I respected it, he said. Love is for things that can betray you. In Holland in the fall, a village priest learned to measure mercy by the altitude of dots in the sky. If the dots were high and slender, bombs would fall somewhere else, on someone he did not know. If the dots were broad-shouldered and descended in pairs, the danger was intimate, for those airplanes aimed not at cities, but at roads and guns, and the unlucky cart that chose the wrong field. Track. One afternoon, he stood beside a woman holding a baby and watched two jugs quarrel with a German supply column. The woman flinched with every pass. The priest did not. He had watched wolves in winter and understood the arithmetic. When it ended, he crossed himself, not because he knew the names of the men who died, but because the road was clear again and children would eat. The narrator, who had been a shadow in hangars and a breath in headsets, spoke again when a young pilot folded his parachute on his bunk and did not know that he would never use it. You are not the protagonist of today. The road is, he said. You are not the point, the bridge is. To make peace with this is to become excellent at the job. The young man did not hear him. He was rolling his chute neatly because neatness was an argument against fear. Trouble also came from above, painted in the metallic sheen of German jets. The Me-262 sliced air like a blade made of future. They were rare, hard to catch, except during takeoff and landing, and terrifying in the seconds when they filled your canopy. The jug had no hope of matching them for raw speed, but the war did not require it. When intelligence mapped the jet's airfields, Thunderbolts learned a new duty: loiter near the runways and strike the jets when their advantage dissolved into vulnerability. It was an ugly assignment, low, exposed, full of flak. But crews understood the exchange rate. Every 262 burning on a concrete strip was one less scythe thrown through a bomber box. In January, on a snow-paled field near St. Vith, a jug came back with its right main gear refusing to lock. The pilot cycled it, cursed it, and accepted the inevitable. He set up for a one-wheel landing with the resignation of a craftsman meeting a stubborn hinge. He touched down gently, too gently, the airplane decided, and dropped its right side anyway. The wingtip bit snow. The propeller carved a series of mortified arcs in the white. The jug slewed and settled and went quiet. Men ran, as they always run, when luck delivers a pilot back into their hands. He climbed out, angry only at himself. The crew chief put a mittened hand on his shoulder. We'll have her right by morning, he said. It was not bravado. It was a contract. One night the weather closed like a fist, and men found themselves trapped between the instinct to get home and the math that said they would not. The flight lead made the only decision that had a future in it. They diverted to a field that was little more than a rumor, dead reckoned off a river bend and a cathedral spire. They came in low over dark houses and found a smear of pierced steel planking, lit by the humility of 3 lanterns. One by one they landed, spread across the field like tired crows, and taxied to a halt. In the morning, a farmer arrived, eyes wide, and asked the most practical question in Europe. Do you need fuel? They did. He pointed with 2 fingers and a story. Headman, dairy, sawmill, men with cans who would understand the trade. Before noon, the jugs were heavy again, and by afternoon, the bridge downstream was light by 1 span. Rumor travels in 2 directions during a war: upward as legend, downward as orders. The jug's reputation traveled both ways. Commanders began to plan with it as a given capability, a hammer they could trust to find and hit nails they could not see from their tents. At the same time, civilians told each other that the broad-nosed Americans shot only at machines. It was not always true. War is not a gentleman's sport, but it was truer when thunderbolts flew than when bombs fell in carpets, and truth in war is often delivered with margins rather than absolutes. Germany's railways tried every trick that cleverness and desperation could devise. They moved at night without lights. They hid locomotives under bridges and in tunnels. They decoupled cars and scattered them in woods. Jugs learned to look for signatures rather than shapes. The scrape of frost off pine where men had hidden coal, the shine of fresh hammer marks on a track, the tired geometry of a camouflage net that had been moved too many times. When they found those signatures, they documented them with the indifference of professionals and destroyed them with the passion of men tired of being shot at. In late March, a pilot who had never missed a briefing missed one and spent the morning in a doctor's tent with a fever. His flight took off without him and hit flak heavy enough to please an artillery colonel. He felt the guilt of the spared. In the afternoon, he found himself assigned to a mixed patrol, 2 P-47s, 2 P-51s, a flexible experiment to test coverage over an area that had served as an enemy assembly ground. They found little but ghosts until a white road produced a moving dot. The Mustangs dived and pulled up, reporting no target, a farmer's truck. The jug pilot hesitated, then rolled and went to look. It was a mobile flak gun under pastry camouflage. He saw the muzzle flash and did not feel anything until after he was climbing again, and his left forearm went dull. He had fired long enough to see the gun stop pretending to be a truck and start pretending to be wreckage. He landed one-handed, lost consciousness on the taxi, and woke to his crew chief explaining, as if about a lawnmower, that the shell had done nothing a welder couldn't forgive. The doctor stitched his arm with a speed that did not feel like kindness and asked what he had learned. "That trucks can lie," he said. The doctor wrote it down as if it were a diagnosis. A curious thing happened as the front approached the German border towns. The jug slowed the enemy's retreat by speeding up his caution. Columns that could have dashed accepted a crawl. Regiments that should have marched scattered and reassembled. Maneuver ruptured into stuttering. It is hard to fight fluidly when the sky taxes every movement at compound rates. Strategies that had relied on tempo discovered that tempo had become a debt. In the East, Soviet ground attack pilots did their own brutal arithmetic with Il-2s. The Allies were partners by circumstance, not design, but the parallel was striking. Thick skins, heavy guns, pilots who understood that survival is the root of tactics. Occasionally, rumors leaked back through prisoners that German units fought differently against machines they could not easily kill. It was not superstition. It was experience wearing data as armor. The jug also changed the way some American infantry thought about courage. A platoon pinned by fire could call on a shape in the sky and feel, for the first time in hours, that their courage had partners. One sergeant told a chaplain that he had stopped bargaining with God and started talking directly to the air controller. "God sent him," the chaplain said. The sergeant nodded without humor. "Then God reads maps," he said. The war's end approached like a slow thunder heard through walls. Buildings were already broken, bridges already down. Pilots who had once argued for credits began to argue for rest. The jug kept flying. It escorted surrendering machines to fields that had forgotten how to refuel pride. It strafed trucks that still disobeyed logic. It orbited columns of refugees and did nothing, and that doing nothing felt like a new skill. When a pilot asked his ops officer whether the day's last sortie had a target, the man blinked, consulted a paper that had fewer lines than yesterday, and said, "Bring the boys home." On a bright morning near the end, a formation passed over a camp ringed with wire. Men below looked up with faces so thin that even hope had edges. The pilots did not know what they were looking at, not yet. They were told only that a railway siding nearby mattered in a way that ordinary sidings did not. They felt the world growing heavier without knowing why. Days later, when someone explained, a long quiet fell in the ready room. No one spoke. The jug had many enemies. None of them had been hunger. The men who flew went to sleep that night inside a new definition of victory and woke older. After the surrender, engineers from both sides toured each other's factories the way scholars tour ruins. Germans looked at American production lines with unbelief. Americans looked at German machine tools with respect and unease. One American engineer traced a finger along the casting of a turbo housing and smiled at a curve he knew from his own plant. "We did right by this," he said. He did not mean the metal alone. He meant the decision that mass and protection could be virtues without apology. A German engineer, looking at rows of battered but functioning air-cooled radials, conceded a point in the quiet way professionals do when they are defeated by a colleague rather than by an enemy. "You chose wisely for your war," he said. Stories settled as stories do into archetypes. The Mustang became the sleek duelist, the Lightning the clever, Hunter, the Spitfire, the faithful blade. The Jug's story was stranger. The patient worker who also, when needed, became a storm. Pilots who had flown all of them laughed when writers tried to turn preference into theology. "You love the one that brought you home," a man said, and the room nodded like a single neck. In a museum decades later, a boy stood under the wing of a restored Thunderbolt and asked his grandfather whether this was really a fighter. The old man, who had never flown but had learned to live because someone else did, put a hand on the boy's head and said it was the best kind of fighter, the kind that ends fights quickly. The boy did not understand yet. He would when he learned that some victories are quiet and happen off stage, in the logistics, in the maintenance shop, in the choice to thicken a spar rather than thin it for applause. The narrator had one last observation to offer before silence took him back. "A culture reveals itself by what it rewards," he said. In this war, the nations that rewarded endurance outlasted those that rewarded elegance. The Thunderbolt is a sentence in that language. Read it slowly. It says, "Protect the human, multiply the effort, return tomorrow." The wind moved across an empty field as if agreeing. Peace did not abolish the airplane. It changed its verbs. The Jug no longer hunted. It demonstrated. It no longer prowled roads. It toured air shows and agricultural fairs, its big engine converting gasoline into nostalgia. Men who had watched it from trenches watched it now from lawn chairs, and the distance between those two postures is a definition of civilization. Pilots who had once learned to judge a town by the thickness of its flak now judged a crowd by the brightness of its children's eyes. When the pilot advanced the throttle for a low pass, he did it with the same precision with which he had once advanced it for a strafing run. And somewhere in that symmetry lived a private redemption. In Latin America, in the Balkans, across Asia, airfields with uneven concrete and mechanics, with the calm of men who make do welcomed second-hand thunderbolts. They wore new flags and learned new languages of command. They taught young pilots the old lessons: energy over flourish, patience over bravado. The runway is not a theater. The enemy does not care if you are handsome. Some of those pilots grew old with the Jug, and some grew old because of it. Both fates proved the airplane's continued usefulness. A group of engineers in the American Midwest kept a corner of their plant as a shrine to the double wasp. Not because it was perfect, it was stubborn, heavy, thirsty, but because it had been enough. They told apprentices that in design there's a triangle of desire: performance, protection, production, and that a grown nation chooses its corner wisely. When they pointed to the Jug in a photograph, they spoke not of glamour, but of balance. "This is what happens," one of them said, "when you optimize for coming home." The men who had flown her scattered into peacetime like bright fragments. Some became airline captains and learned to their surprise that the sky could be boring, a gift they never resented. Some became teachers and taught students to recognize in engines the sound of intent. Some could not find a substitute for the clarity they had once known at 300 knots, and they wandered for a while before discovering that clarity comes in other uniforms: fatherhood, friendship, quiet work. A few never spoke of it at all and kept their stories in the oil-stained language of memory. When they met each other, their conversation needed few nouns and many verbs: went, hit, held, came back. Keller, the German who had laughed and then learned, worked as a surveyor after the war, walking fields and measuring distances for roads that would carry a piece he had not expected to live long enough to use. He saw the countryside without barbed wire and felt surprised by how large it looked. Once, while pacing out a right-of-way near a rebuilt bridge, he heard a radial engine overhead and looked up reflexively, expecting fear. None came. A restored jug crossed the sun, harmless and magnificent, and the old reflex dissolved into a strange gratitude. He removed his hat, not as salute, but as accommodation to wonder. If you live long enough, your enemies become your monuments. There are photographs that try to contain this entire story in a single frame. A pilot leaning on a cowl with a grin that conceals exhaustion. A crewman sleeping under a wing whose shadow is kinder than the barracks roof. A road strafed into silence and then repaired into usefulness by the same men who once hid from the strafers. In each of these images, the jug is not just a machine. It is an argument that design can be humane, even in war, especially in war. The children who had drawn barrels with wings grew into the adults who curate museums and design curricula. They learned to explain to visitors why an airplane with a face only a mechanic could love mattered more than a dozen pretty failures. Sometimes they offer a demonstration. They roll a model down a wind tunnel track and show how a thick wing stalls late and forgives clumsiness, how an air-cooled radial tolerates abuse, how armor steals speed and repays it with life. A teenager in the audience objects that the jug looks slow. The curator smiles the secret smile of those who know. It was fast where it counted, she says, at bringing men home. The teenager nods, because the logic is clear even when the heart is not ready to receive it. The heart will catch up. A pilot who once flew a jug over France now flies nothing larger than a memory over his morning coffee. He keeps a photograph near the window, a jug on a steel plate runway, dawn behind it like a rumor. Sometimes he hears a neighbor's lawnmower sputter and, in that moment, recalls with perfect clarity the one cough an engine makes before it decides to run or die. He remembers the sound his own heart made in that second, a small sound compared to a radial, but audible to a man who has learned to listen to engines seriously. In those moments, he does not miss youth. He misses certainty. Then he looks at the photograph and forgives the world for moving on. The narrator, the voice that stands a step outside of time, offered his final aside while a museum docent locked a glass case around a set of 50 caliber gun barrels. Weapons are truths we say out loud, he said. This one says, I will meet chaos with order and return at dusk. It is not a boast. It is a vow. He waited a courteous second for the room to acknowledge him. No one did. He smiled, which is to say, he went silent. The jug's legend does not insist on more than it deserves. It asks for no marble, no hymn. It permits itself a nickname that sounds like a joke and wears it like a badge. If you push your hand against the side of its cowl, even now, you can feel how the shape resists being made into myth. It insists on being a tool. This humility is why the myth survives. Men prefer honest legends to glorious lies. Engineers prefer a machine that keeps its appointments. Commanders prefer a wing that achieves effects instead of promising qualities. Civilians prefer the sound of an airplane that bends the air without tearing it. In a narrow sense, the jug's career ended the moment jets made speed, the only argument that mattered. In a wider sense, it never ended. Every time a designer chooses to thicken a spar rather than polish a fairing, the jug nods. Every time a test pilot praises an airplane for talking to him through the stick rather than thrilling him with a brochure, the jug nods. Every time a soldier on the ground believes that someone above understands his map, the jug nods. This is how machines live after their rivets have cooled, as standards that outlast the events that forged them. There was one last flight for a certain Thunderbolt, whose logbook had survived nearly everything else. The restorers had painted her as faithfully as they could. The paint was new, the dents were old. The pilot that day was a man who had been born after the war ended, and yet spoke to the airplane with the familiarity of a grandson addressing a grandparent. He lined up, advanced the throttle, and felt the tremor work its way through the structure, like a memory finding its footing. The wheels left the earth reluctantly, as they had always done. And then, with the old inevitability, the airplane became what it had always been. The argument that mass, handled with skill, is a kind of grace. He made a pass down the runway at a speed that made photographers happy and regulators nervous. The sound was not a snarl. It was a complicated chord, mechanical sympathy, compressor whine, the bright percussion of exhaust. Children clapped because adults clapped. Adults clapped because they remembered things they had never personally seen. The pilot rolled, climbed into a sky that had room for every ghost, and leveled at a height where perspective clarifies. From there, the field was a toy, and the people were spare parts of a single story. He turned for home. He lowered the wheels. Sidewinds made their old argument. He countered with his old answer. Rubber met concrete. The airplane hopped once, annoyed at gravity's imprecision, and settled. The crowd cheered politely. The pilot taxied in, shut down, and let the quiet grow until it was large enough to contain what had just happened. He put his hand on the cowl and did not remove it quickly. The metal still held the sun. He thought of men who had done the same gesture and found in it a prayer that required no words. If you insist on a moral, accept this. Speed is not the only mercy. Endurance is merciful too. So is forgiveness. The kind a machine gives a human when the human errs and the machine declines to make the error fatal. The Thunderbolt, derided as too slow, proved swift in every domain that mattered to mortal creatures. It was fast to return fire, fast to soak damage without complaint, fast to return for a second pass, fast to deliver relief, fast to teach lessons that took cultures a generation to absorb. It did not need to win races. It needed to end arguments. It did. The last word belongs to no man. It belongs to a runway at dusk, warm and patient, holding the weight of a machine that once held the weight of men's hopes. The engine ticks as it cools. The crew wheel her into a hangar where the lights are not bright but are sufficient. A door closes with the sound of a job concluded without fanfare. Tomorrow will come, as it always does, and there will be other machines to fly and other arguments to end. If thunder speaks again, and it will, someone will remember the first time they mistook it for a joke, and someone else will help them understand. They called it too slow. In the end, it made haste in the only direction that matters. Back to the men who needed it. Forward to the world they would repair.